Chapter 5. Buttoning the last button of her cream-colored blouse, Sanaa tucked in the tail of the shirt into the waistband of her gray pencil skirt before grabbing the matching gray jacket hanging on the closet door. Her black pumps clacked with an echo across the empty house with each of her steps down the wooden stairs. Walking into the kitchen, Sanaa draped the suit jacket across the empty island counter and grabbed a coffee mug from the cabinet. Looking out through the window over the sink, she scanned the peacefulness of the large green yard, surrounded by the thick wall of pine trees, worming past her defenses not for the first time since she stepped back into Tarki. Sanaa wondered if she made a mistake. The house felt more like a mausoleum of memories rather than the fresh start she was hoping for. This house needed to be filled with life. Needed to have laughter and aromas of family meals breathing life into it. Not just the life of one lonely woman rattling around inside. Hearing the ding to her coffee machine, Sanaa grabbed the cup and poured in her creamer. Life back in Seattle, however, wouldn't have been that much better, she reasoned. Just thinking of all the surprise introductions to possible suitors her mother had tricked her into over the years actually helped the weight in her chest lessen a bit. No, this wasn't a mistake. If anything, the simple choice of putting some distance between herself and her parents was more than enough to help her put things into perspective. Life in Seattle had become a monotonous chore of visiting her parents, work, a lackluster social life, and miserably failed dates. There was nothing left for her in Seattle. Something deep in her soul told her that her future was here in Tarki. She just needed to give it a chance. Drinking the last of her coffee, she rinsed out the mug and set it in the sink. It was time to start the first day of her new job. With very little acceleration, Sanaa drove her SUV down the narrow drive from her house towards the small cluster of the 5 other houses located on her street. Each house was appropriately positioned from one another to give each person the illusion of solitude but the simultaneous feeling of community. In Tarki, people wanted their space. They wanted to feel independent of the majority, the feeling of being king of their territory while at the same time knowing they only needed to wave for a helping hand. Like links to a chain in Tarki, your neighbor was an extended member of the family. They were the first person you called for help and the first person you invited to the party. They were your support whether you wanted them or not. With a groan, Sanaa reluctantly looked over to the first red house on the right. Standing on his porch with a mug in one hand, wearing a pair of jeans and a red polo shirt, Zaccaria leaned one shoulder casually against the wooden porch pillar, as if waiting for her. His golden eyes cut to hers with alarming accuracy before giving her a nod with a slow smirk. Ripping her gaze from him, she forced herself to stay focused on the road. Damn that man. Damn him to hell. She could not believe he was her actual neighbor. A large part of her was hoping he was lying or exaggerating. Maybe he just owned the house but didn't live in it, or it was currently under his property management company and he planned to rent it out. Nope, nope, and nope. He was her actual neighbor, for heaven's sake. Glancing back up to her mirror, she watched in shock as he flung the remainder of his mug's content into the bushes and walked purposely towards his truck. If there was a moment of doubt as to what Zac was doing, it was quickly obliterated with certainty as he followed her all the way to the city hall. Doing her best to ignore him, Sanaa carefully stepped out of her parked car and grabbed her thin leather briefcase. Getting in and out of cars while wearing a pencil skirt was an art form that should be carried into the Olympics, in her opinion. Closing her car door, Sanaa tried to ignore the sound of another heavier door closing not too far behind her. With purposeful steps, she crossed the parking lot and climbed the steps to the city hall, stopping at the top at the sight of a familiar smile. Just as big as she remembered, Adam Wati stood like a bear of a man above all the rest. With short cropped black hair and a large warm smile to match his gentle amber eyes, Adam Wati's was the only man she had ever met that intimidated her and filled her with joy. At the same time, Sanaa, my dear girl, you have grown into one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Get over here and give me a hug. With his arms spread wide, Sanaa gladly rushed forward and complied. His hug felt just like they always did, strong and full of love. Releasing her, Adam stepped back, and she finally noticed he was standing next to another man who she could only assume was related in some way. With the same dark complexion all the Wati's clan had and the same jet black silky hair. The man gave her a friendly smile before averting his warm gaze to look over her shoulder. Sanaa didn't need to look behind her to know who the overwhelming presence approaching her belonged to. Focusing on the men in front of her, she ignored Zac. "Thank you, Mr. Watis." She smiled softly at the tall, jovial man. "How have you been?" Adam laughed. "My sweet girl, you do not have to be so proper anymore. Your bossy parents aren't here, and I think you're old enough now, so please call me Adam." Feeling the heat rush to her cheeks, she gave a sheepish nod before replying. "Okay, Adam," she tested slowly, the name feeling foreign on her lips. Both men laughed good-naturedly at her attempt. "My name is Kevin," the second man introduced himself, offering her his hand. "I'm this scowling person's cousin." He nodded to Zac, who was standing directly at her right now. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she replied politely just as the wind blew her hair from around her shoulders and into her face. Turning to face the wind so that she could straighten her hair, Sanaa caught Zac's penetrating golden gaze. Flustered, Sanaa scooped her hand under the weight of her hair and gathered it to the side before stepping towards the building's tall glass doors with every intention of getting out of the wind and away from Zac. "I am here to meet with the mayors of all 3 cities, she began to explain. As she reached for the door, Kevin was faster than her. Opening the door, he politely held it open for her to go through. "Oh, we know," Adam spoke as he and the other 2 men followed her into the building. "We are here for the same meeting." The clicking of her pumps against the tile floor stopped as she turned around to face all 3 men with evident confusion. This time it was Zac who spoke, his deep, dangerous voice resonating off the walls and directly through her. "We will be the local team that helps assist you in whatever field engineer you hire." First her home, then turning out to be her neighbor, and now this. It was more than simply purposeful. This was a plan of attack. "Is there a problem, Ms. Bott?" Zac's dark voice taunted smoothly. His black eyebrows moved up a fraction of an inch at his inquiry, forcing her eyes to travel further over his beautiful dark skin and silky black hair, pulled into a low bun at the base of his neck. His hair shined like an obsidian jewel in the sun. "Damn him." Straightening her shoulders, she cast Zac a cold look. "Of course not, Mr. Watis." A flash of worry passed through Adam's kind eyes, not missing the note of mockery from Zac and tension from her. Turning on her heel, Sanaa put her back to Zac and walked to the receptionist. "So, what you are stating, Ms. Bott, is that the wind turbine initiative we had planned wouldn't be feasible." The disappointment on Monique Foundry's face was clear. As mayor of Tarkey, she sat sandwiched between Thomas Jansen, the mayor of Antier Falls, and Gabriel Mossack of Galding. Out of the 3, Monique was the youngest and, from what Sanaa could tell, the ringleader of the 2. She reminded Sanaa of every one of her aunts and her mother, the type of woman who could get her master's in physics while juggling a baby on her hip and keeping a watchful eye of a toddler at her heels and still graduate summa cum laude. Shaking her head with a smile, Sanaa quickly tried to dispel the cloud of disappointment that hung over the 3 officials. Taking some copies from her portfolio, Sanaa slid the documents across the table for them to take. "No, that's not exactly the case. It's just that the initiative as you have documented in your proposal, well," Sanaa gave them a gentle smile, looking for the best way to say what needed to be said. "Let's just say that it has very generous numbers when it comes to production versus cost." "Please, Ms. Bott." Thomas Jansen raised his hand to stop her. "We know of your background and expertise, and we are becoming well aware that the last city engineer we hired as a consultant conned us out of a good deal of money." Thomas cast a blaming eye to Gabriel Mossack, who looked away guiltily. "Please, don't sugarcoat it. We want to hear exactly what we can do." Nodding, Sanaa took a deep breath, pushing aside the knowledge that all 3 Watis men were sitting directly behind her in the row of chairs that lined the large conference room wall. Silent and watchful, for some reason it felt like they were 3 guardsmen at her back, ready to fight if she simply gave the word. The idea was preposterous, but she could swear that is what it felt like. "Okay, so here is the full situation. All 3 of your cities would ideally like to get off of Oregon's power grid as much as possible, which is understandable due to the increase in Oregon forest fires, rising rates, and neighboring California's constant instability. However, the cost of this goal would make no sense financially to you or your citizens. I see that on page 32 of your outline you projected having 10 wind turbines for Antier Falls, 8 for Tarky and 3 for Galding. Understandably, the thinking behind the turbines is that since the area is notoriously windy, you should yield higher power generation, correct? Receiving nods from all three, she continued. Here is the ugly truth regarding wind turbines. On average, they never generate the capacity they state they can. Industry estimates project an annual output of 30 to 40%, but real-world experience shows that annual outputs are typically 15% and on some occasions 30% capacity. So wind turbines are out? Asked Gabriel, whose forehead was starting to set into a permanent crease. Not necessarily, Sana soothed. There are a few non-profit programs that will basically give each city a couple of turbines for you to install for free. However, I think what will improve each city's power production is expanding your solar farms for each city and, of course, renegotiating your current rates. Our rates can be renegotiated? Monique's tone was dubious, but there was a flare of hope in her eye. Ms. Bott, we were told explicitly we could not renegotiate our rates at all. Thomas Jansen informed her soberly. She intoned. Looking through her folder, she found the sheets of paper she marked with yellow tabs. Well, since I was already approved for the position, I took the liberty and called a contact of mine and had your rates negotiated to what you see here. Pulling out 3 separate pieces of paper, she slid them across the heavy oak table, to which they all greedily pulled forward. These rates are contingent, of course, if you go the route of increasing the solar panels, thus increasing your own production, meaning the electrical provider can calculate sending less power this way and put that energy elsewhere since consumption should be lower. By the time the meeting was over, the look of disappointment had faded entirely from the mayor's faces. The information of projected savings to each town and their citizens seemed to be more than satisfactory. I do not think I have ever seen those 3 that happy, Adam pointed out, with a chuckle as all 4 of them walked back to their vehicles. I swear at a few points Gabriel looked as if he was going to have a small heart attack at the bad and the good news, Kevin added brightly. I'm just happy I could show them I was a worthwhile pick, Sana added, completely aware of the silent looming presence behind her as she walked. Zac had yet to say anything during the meeting or out of it. His silence was more than unnerving. She would rather him say something taunting or snarky, rather than this heavy unbearable silence. Of course you are, Sana, Adam kindly assured her. Now tell me, what time should we meet you at the solar farm site? Oh. Blinking in surprise, she glanced down at her thin gold watch on her wrist. Well, I'm ready now if you are. Are you now? Adam looked her up and down and glanced at Kevin at his side, who smiled wider. Looking back at her, Adam gave her a considering look. It's pretty muddy due to the rain early this morning. Are you sure? No, it's fine. I have 4-wheel drive, so it won't be a problem, she assured them proudly. She didn't want to start off their working relationship on a bad foot. After spending nearly 2 hours in that meeting, she knew these men were ready to go to the site now. Technically, she would be their boss until she hired a field engineer to maintain the equipment between the 3 cities, and though her role would be purely a diagnostic position, she didn't want them to see her as someone who was afraid to go out in the field when necessary. Adam's gaze drifted from her over to her right to where Zac stood before speaking. All right then, follow us out. Sana could have sworn there was some sort of unspoken dialogue shared in their looks, but she refused to even look at Zac to confirm her suspicions. Getting into her car, she kept her eyes focused on Adam's truck as he and Kevin jumped inside. From her peripheral vision, she could see the outline of Zac's tall body as he casually walked around to his door and got inside. The solar farm was set up on the far edge of town, right where the main road that ran through the middle of the town turned back into the highway leading to Antier Falls, where it eventually dead-ended. Just off the road they took a sharp right back towards the forest. No longer a road, her SUV bumped easily along the muddy man-made path until they reached a clearing that was made in the forest's tree line. About 30 yards wide, the site was filled with only a quarter of the panels. Grabbing her camera in her passenger seat, Sana opened her door and began to step out before pausing. Standing just outside her door was Zac. Silently he looked at her before meaningfully looking at the ground beneath her door. Following his gaze, she immediately realized her mistake. It wasn't simply Muddy drive, the ground was caked in fresh upturned mud from the vehicles passing through. Sana looked from the thick earthy mud to her pristine black Manolo Blahnik shoes with considerable distress. Her mother bought her these shoes just as she did with nearly every name brand shoe Sana owned. Every holiday, her mother gifted her with the finest shoes she could find. In her mother's opinion, shoes were for women what a good suit was for men. I don't think I was listening carefully when Adam mentioned the mud. Her struggle to find the right words while thinking of a possible solution to this problem was abruptly cut off with a clipped scream. Firm hands grabbed her with speed and precision she only ever seemed to experience in life with Zac. The grip hooking under her knees pulled her out of the car while his other arm snaked around her back. With one effortless motion she was out of the car and high against his chest. She was still sputtering with outrage when Zac turned his head and spoke over his shoulder. Kevin, grab those wooden boards from my back seat and put them down over here. Angry and mortified, Sana couldn't do or say anything as he walked with her towards the boards Kevin laid out. Never once in her adult life had she ever been carried like this. Sana hated every second of it. She hated that her fists were wrapped tightly into the cotton fiber of his polo shirt. She wanted to let go, but with each gentle sway of his steps, she couldn't make herself let go. She refused to look at Adam or Kevin's faces, which were most assuredly set in laughter. Waiting until he set her gently down onto the wooden board, she fixed him with a heated look. That was completely unnecessary, Mr. Watees. It was very necessary since you decided to wear this, he gestured to her outfit, to a worksite, Ms. Bott, and it will be necessary the second time when I take you back to your car. He was baiting her. The derisively polite way he said her name, the mockery in his words, it was all a game to make her break from the unspoken game he started between them first. Well, she refused. Crossing her arms, she gave him her most chilling look. I appreciate your misguided kindness, Mr. Watees. She made sure to stress his name the same way. He said hers. However, I rather walk back with shoes in hand than have you humiliate me a second time. I'm afraid that is a no-can-do, Ms. Bott. Zac's deep voice was like velvety thunder while his golden eyes crackled with lightning as he countered back. This area is a worksite and has a high probability of having dangerous debris scattered about, nails, screws, bits of fiberglass. I cannot allow you to get hurt. Then I will just walk with the shoes. She shot back in exasperation, no longer caring about the shoes. She just couldn't believe she was having this argument like this. No one could rile her like this but him, forcing her out of her shell to snap at him, which he probably secretly enjoyed. Zac shook his head. The mud is deep, and they will get stuck. By now both Adam and Kevin were watching the two with a mixture of worry and fascination. Then maybe Kevin can. No. His voice snapped with quiet warning. His golden eyes seemed to flash brighter, and his dark pupils constricted tighter, pinning her down with finality. Once done you will turn to me, he emphasized. And you will put your arms around my neck and I will take you back to your car. Now is this a good spot to take your pictures and gather the info you need, or do you need me to carry you to another spot around the panels? Her heart was pounding with uncontrollable rage, fighting to control her response. Sana turned her head to look out over his shoulder. A cool breeze blew a portion of her long dark hair from over her shoulder into her face. Swiping it away with the back of her fingers, she watched as his gaze followed every detail of the movement. Deciding not to give him a reply, she turned around on the board and pointed her camera to the site. After asking Adam a few questions regarding the initial setup of the panels and possible installation timeframe of the new panels, she entered the details into her tablet, all the while ignoring the silent presence of heat radiating off her back. With Zac this close, everything felt off. Her skin felt overly sensitive and her stomach tightened. Some part of her kept expecting his touch, but he never did. Eventually she gathered all the data she needed. With dread and little choice, she turned carefully around on the wooden board and looked up to Zac's waiting smirk. You ready? He asked. Yes. She forced the word from her lips, hating him all the more for it. Then put your arms around my neck, he instructed. She should slap him. She wanted to slap him so hard she wanted to knock that pretty little man bun loose. Biting her lip to help contain the urge to yell at him, she raised her arms and slipped them around his strong neck. The Warmth from his body and the brush of his silky hair against her skin made her want to weep and slap him all the more. Leaning forward so that his mouth barely brushed her ear, he scooped one hand underneath her knees, pulling her up and off the ground as he whispered into her ear. "Good girl." The simple phrase brought back a flood of summertime memories. Whispered threats and stolen kisses, gentle caresses, and the feeling of sharp teeth scraping along her neck. Keeping her eyes averted from his, she allowed him to carry her back to her car. Skillfully, he opened her door and sat her down in the driver's seat, but he did not step away, blocking her door. He stood there cornering her in her seat. Still not looking at him, Sana made a show of putting her camera away and her keys in the ignition, hoping he would take the hint and leave. "Is there anything else, Mr. Watiz? Or are you worried I cannot drive home safely?" He wanted her to look at him. She could feel it in the pulsating waves of tension building around them. Knowing him, remembering the impulsive young man she used to know, she knew this restraint cost him dearly. Glancing down at his hands, she nearly smiled while her heart rate soared simultaneously at the sight of his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. He wanted to grab her, to force her to look at him. She would not give him the satisfaction. Finally, after the seconds ticked by in their battle of wills, she heard Adam speak over Zach's shoulder. "Once I receive that order of panels, I will call you, Sana." There was an added level of pleasantness she could hear forced into the older man's tone before he roughly growled something in a language she had only heard sporadically in her years in Tarki, a language only the Katsi people spoke to one another. Sana nearly let out a deep breath of relief as Zach finally stepped back and gently shut her car door, waving to Adam and Kevin, who both looked at her with worried smiles before quickly turning with frowns to Zach. Sana slowly drove out of the clearing and back to town. She wasn't sure what Zach was up to or why he was playing this cruel game with her after all these years, but she knew one thing: she had to stay away from him. Just like all those years ago, that indefinable feeling had surfaced all over again. That enticing lure that pulled her to him and into his touch. The feeling that made her want to shut her eyes and give him everything he asked. For without question, not again, she couldn't put herself through that torment again. For the sake of everything, Zaccariah Watiz had to be avoided at all costs. Staying away from someone who had the exact opposite intentions was a near impossible task. No matter where she went or what time of day she left, Sana kept running into Zach. Either he was standing outside of his house working on his motorcycle, or at City Hall he was always around and always watching, though admittedly he was always very professional when it came to actual work. He allowed Adam and Kevin to communicate with her in regards to the job, simply providing assistance to the other two when needed. It was only the moment she stepped out of her job did Sana feel as if she exited some sort of safe zone and entered the fray of the hunt. He wanted her to break. She remembered this man well enough to know how he operated. He wanted her to feel cornered and frustrated so that she would eventually confront him. Sana sneered at the thought. She wasn't the same girl she was all those years ago when she allowed him to dominate her summers. He was going to understand that one way or another. After 4 days, the little bit of groceries she had brought with her from Seattle were officially depleted. Staring into her open fridge, Sana frowned at the nearly empty container of almond milk and a half-empty jar of marmalade. Shutting the refrigerator door, she swiped her keys and purse from the kitchen island and walked to the front door. Glancing at herself in the mirror, she gave a mental nod of approval to her jeans, white sneakers, and yellow pullover sweatshirt. Starting the car, she took a deep breath as she drove forward and down the drive towards the red house in the distance. "Please do not be home," she prayed. Sitting in the driveway was Zach's large truck, but there was no sign of the golden-eyed owner, nor his bike. Thank God, she thought. She wasn't sure if she could handle his penetrating stare today, not without running him over. The little fantasy put a smile on her face all the way to the store. Lambert's Grocers was probably the last bastion of unchanged Americana commerce left in the Pacific Northwest. Owned by the city, the grocery store has stood strong over the decades against the constant temptation of larger chains threatening to move into town. Pushing her cart through the aisles, Sana couldn't imagine Tarki without Lambert's. Anything else would just feel wrong. Grabbing a couple of bags of noodles, Sana stiffened at the sudden, hair-raising feeling at the back of her neck. With a sudden surge of anger, She turned around on her heel and looked around, fully expecting to see a familiar golden-eyed man standing nearby. But Zac wasn't there. No one was on the aisle except for her. Sighing, she tossed the noodles into her basket. She was letting him get to her, and she told herself explicitly she wouldn't. Pushing her cart a little further down the aisle, she grabbed a few bottles of olive oil and bags of rice. Sana bought. The hesitant voice sounded from the end of the aisle. Looking up, Sana saw a very pregnant woman standing behind her cart, giving Sana a hopeful expression. Making eye contact, the woman smiled brighter and pushed her cart closer until she was right next to Sana. Oh hi, I'm sorry to bother you. It's me, Ardath. Do you remember me? We used to sweep the movie theater floors together for free movie passes in the summer. Memories of the curly-headed girl with the same warm smile flooded back to Sana. Looking closer at her face, she realized it was indeed Ardath. Back then, Ardath had kept her hair bleached nearly bright white while purposely keeping her roots dark brown. Ardath had worn nothing but stylishly ripped jeans when they were younger and a collection of her brother's old rock band t-shirts. The woman that stood in front of her now almost looked like a teacher with her large sweater and plain leggings, compared to the girl from Sana's memories. Pulling her cart to the side to keep the aisle clear, Sana greeted the woman. Oh, Ardath. I'm so sorry, I didn't even recognize you. No, do not even worry about it. I haven't been able to dye my hair in years since I'm either pregnant or breastfeeding. She raised a hand to comb nervously through her shoulder-length brown hair. And I'm as big as a house. So there's that. Sana laughed. You are not that big, and congratulations. Thank you, you're sweet, but I swear to God I'm so over it at this point. Ardath let out a ragged sigh, immediately sinking into the familiar comfort with her as if there hadn't been years between their last visit at all. Kevin doesn't yet realize it, but this is our last one. If he wants more, he can have them. Anyways, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ramble. After Kevin told me you had moved back into town for good, I thought we should have a welcome party for you. She beamed at her suggestion. Before Sana could even process or respond, Ardath continued right along excitedly. Just you, me, and some other women you may remember. Mostly Wati's women. Wait, did you say Kevin? Kevin Wati's is your husband. Sana was desperately trying to put together the influx of information. Yes, she smiled proudly. He told me you're his new boss. No, not at all, Sana rushed to correct. We will simply be working together on a few projects. You're so modest, Sana. Ardath patted her playfully on the arm. I just knew you would be the same sweet Sana that would watch crappy horror movies with me back then. I'm so glad you're back. A dark, unmoving shape in her peripheral caught Sana's attention. A thin, disheveled-looking man stood at the end of the aisle, staring directly at her. His dark, empty gaze kept moving back and forth over her features, never staying in one place too long. It was as if he was scanning every detail of her body, clothes, and features and committing it to memory. Sana took an instinctive step back from his intrusive stare. Following her line of sight, Ardath pursed her lips in a frown before setting them into a tight fake smile. Waving, she called out to the man. Hello, Mr. Becker. How are you doing today? Looking as if he mumbled something under his breath, the man gave Sana one last dark look before walking away. That is just Walter Becker, Ardath said, turning back to her with a lowered voice. He moved in about 5 or 6 years ago. He runs the gas station. Don't worry about him, he is like that with everybody, Ardath assured her. Greasy old bastard. Anyways, how about tomorrow night around 6? Does that sound good? Oh. Sana had to shake her head to clear her thoughts from that awful man's stare and remember that Ardath mentioned something about a welcome dinner. Yeah, sure, that sounds fine. Okay, great, don't worry about food. We will all bring the food as a welcome gift to you. Later that night, Sana sat in the breakfast nook in her kitchen and worked on her laptop. Reaching for her wine glass, she took a sip of the sweet red wine before forking another bite of the sautéed vegetables of diced onions, capped mushrooms, yellow squash, and asparagus. She had cooked it in a homemade herb butter her grandmother taught her how to make a few years ago. Reading over her document again, she saved it and sent it off to the mayors and sent another more informal version to the Wati's crew. Shutting her laptop, Sana leaned back in the bench seat with her back against the wall. The breakfast Nook was a feature both her grandparents and parents hated about the kitchen, and constantly debated over the years getting it changed. With a walk-in pantry on one side of it and the door that led to a small basement on the other, the Nook was set up a lot like a restaurant booth with 2 long wooden benches and a tabletop that led to a large window at the end. Sanaa loved it. She always had. She loved snuggling against the cool glass with a warm drink, and staring across the lawn to the forest that bordered the property. With only the dim overhead light from the stove still on, Sanaa was able to look out the window perfectly into the night. Tonight was one of those brighter than normal fall nights that made it feel eerie and magical all at the same time. Looking past the old swing set that still sat rusted in the backyard, she scanned the tree line. Her eyes stopped at the darkest spot, where the light of the night seemed to be repelled. Leaning forward until her forehead nearly touched the glass, she squinted harder at the odd black shape. 2 white dots suddenly reflected back at her within the darkness. Going very still, Sanaa barely breathed as she stared back at the 2 glowing eyes. Slowly and deliberately, the dark void moved forward until she could see 2 large paws reaching forward with each step. The black wolf was back, prowling slowly around the swing set. It stalked closer and closer until he stood at the bottom of the stairs at the back door. Not once did it take its eyes from hers. Sitting down, it gave her a waiting stare. What did it want? Fear kept her rooted to her seat while curiosity kept her gaze locked onto the wolf. As if sensing her trepidation, the large wolf moved its front paws and laid down while keeping its head upright. The change in position only made her curiosity grow larger. It looked so soft. Its midnight black fur made her long to reach out and stroke the creature. Sliding off the bench, Sanaa moved to stand at the back door and peered out the window and down the steps to where it sat. Cocking its head to the side with canine curiosity, the creature watched and waited. If she opened the door, would it be startled? Even if she opened the door, there was still a secondary glass storm door that would stand between her and the wolf, meaning she would still have some sort of protection. Her hand paused over the doorknob. What was she even thinking? This was a wolf. A wild wolf that could kill her within minutes if it wanted to. Looking back out the window, she could see that its ears had perked up as it continued to stare at her expectantly. It didn't look vicious, she mentally hedged, though that was probably its ploy. It was most likely using its big furry body and majestic golden gaze to lure idiotic animal lovers out of their house and then eat them. Her hand lowered from the door handle at the thought. Pulling its ears back flat against its head, the wild creature gave her the most pitiful look she had ever seen as it lowered its head between its paws. Dear God, that was low. Frowning, she grabbed the doorknob and turned. Excitedly, the wolf lifted its head but remained laying down. Its black, flagging tail waved with happiness behind it. Standing now with only a thin glass door between them, Sanaa stared at the seemingly docile beast. Now that the door was open, her confidence in this crazy decision was fading fast. The thing was massive, easily about 5 feet long and 2.5, maybe 3 feet tall. What was she thinking? Stepping backward quickly, she shut the door and locked it. Not looking back, she shut off the light and went upstairs. Taking another bite of the delicious crispy fish, Sanaa did her best not to let out a groan of contentment. It was probably the best fish she had ever eaten in her life. It's good, isn't it? Ardath said, sitting across the table from her. Sandra makes the best fried fish in the entire county. Just as promised, Ardath and 2 other women showed up at Sanaa's door directly. At 6 o'clock, gathered at her dining room table, the women laid out enough food to feed at least double the amount of people. Sautéed vegetables, casseroles, pie, dinner rolls, and a huge dish of fried fish. I will be more than happy to give you the recipe, Sanaa, Sandra offered. When Sanaa recognized the woman stepping through her door behind Ardath, her stomach immediately hollowed with nervous energy. She had only seen and spoken to Zach's mother a handful of times all those summers ago, and most of those times she had no idea it was Zach's mom. She was simply the soft-spoken beauty that appeared in town occasionally and volunteered for the handful of city events. On sight, it was apparent the woman was a Wattese. From her dark, honeyed complexion and midnight black hair, Sandra had passed her fine features directly to her renegade son. All except the eyes, of course. Where her son's and brother-in-law's eyes were the traditional Wattese gold, her eyes were a beautiful garnet brown that gave anyone who looked at them a sense of warmth. This tastes so good I'm not sure even with directions, a mentor and a guided video could I replicate this on any level, she confessed flatly. All three women laughed. I'm so glad to see that you came back, Sana, Lana said. A little older than Ardath. Lana was Kevin's older sister. Sana only had a handful of memories of speaking to Lana when she was younger, but from what she did remember, Lana had always carried herself with a quiet confidence that Sana craved to emulate. Sitting next to Ardath across from Sandra, Lana gave Sana a warm, friendly smile. I'm not sure if you remember, but that last couple of summers you were here, you really helped out my son Elijah with his math, Lana recalled. Your tutoring helped him when he went back to school that year. Nearly cried at the improvement in his grades. You did cry, Lana, Ardath corrected dryly. Sandra hid her laughter behind the rim of her wine glass as she took another sip. Yes, I do remember, Sana nodded. She used to sit on her front porch and teach Elijah and her brother a few math lessons here and there between their tag team attempts to coax her to let them go and play. Elijah was always very sweet and patient with me as I tried to refresh myself on how to do the problems. Oh, he better had been. He had his father and Uncle Adam staring daggers into the back of his head if he didn't. Lana shook her head at the memory of her son. Not to mention an angry Zac growling at him since he was monopolizing your attention from him. Sana didn't smile at that memory. She couldn't. The force and intricacy of the memory, one of many she tried to repress, shattered the tight rein she held on her thoughts, allowing them to run wild. Images, smells, and tangible feelings of those days resurfaced. She could see herself sitting on the sun-warmed porch as she faced both Elijah and her brother's small childish faces, set into a firm pout. They had just been whining to let them go play, but Zac's deep reprimand had hushed them both within seconds. Quietly, both boys had listened as she carefully explained the algebraic formula while both of them and herself tried to ignore the surly older teen lounging on the other end of the porch. Zac had wanted to take her to the quarry pond that day. He had worked hard into finally talking her into grabbing her swimsuit and towel. When Elijah arrived with notebooks in hand and a pleading request from his mother to Sana, Zac had surprisingly given up on his plans, but not without a lingering cloud of malice he directed towards poor Elijah. After a few moments of silence, Sana could feel the unspoken conversation of glances being held around her as she focused on her plate. It was Ardath who broke the awkward silence. Can you believe they shut down the old movie theater and opened up a newer one on Turney Street? What? That got her attention. Sana hadn't had a chance to drive through the town and fully see what changed and what remained. She had told herself she would do it this weekend. Really? What happened to the old one near the pharmacy? Don't worry, it's still there. Sandra patted her arm comfortingly. Zac bought it before it could be considered for demolition. The news felt like a punch to the gut. Zac bought it, she repeated in a near whisper. Yeah, him, Kevin, and Adam own a lot of property here in Tarkey, Ardath proudly confirmed. Once Zac came back from the military, he seemed determined to buy up a lot of property. Sana's heart felt as if it were being tied with barbed wire. I see, she managed to say before taking a healthy swallow of wine from her glass. He was doing it again. Just like he did years ago. Zac was trying to monopolize everything about her. He knew how much she cared about that movie theater. Like a fool, she had even mentioned in one of her many emails to him, when he was under the guise of being her property manager, that she hoped Tarkey hadn't changed too much in her absence, especially the old theater. His reply was so standard, so perfectly impersonal, she just breezed right over it when she got it. Don't worry, everything in Tarkey is pretty much the same. Ready and waiting for your return. Now to know that Zac owned it changed everything. Sensing the tension in the room change, Sana tried to clear her thoughts and force her scowl into a tight smile. Looking to brighten the atmosphere, Lana spoke up. Sana, have you heard the story of the Catsy people before? Sana shook her head politely. No, I haven't. Well, Sandra really tells the story the best. Lana smiled serenely to Sandra, with an unspoken plea in her eyes. Of course, Sandra replied warmly to the silent question, smiling obligingly. Sandra leaned back in her seat and sat her wine glass down. As you know, the Catsy people are originally from deep in the forest of British Columbia. Many years ago, the Watis clan broke away from the main tribe and settled further down along the coast, some here in Tarki and some in Antier Falls. When we raised our sons and daughters and opened our arms to new members of our clan, we pass on the same story of our people. It is said that the Creator looked upon man and saw war and many needless deaths. The Creator chose 5 clans among the lands and gave them gifts that no man could comprehend, making these clans more powerful than man. During that time of strife, these chosen clans emerged victorious, commanding control and demanding peace. But as is the nature of all mankind, people grew jealous and wary of these powerful clans, forgetting all that they accomplished and cast them out. With their patience worn away and their pride on edge, the gifted clans abandoned society and sought out new ones amongst themselves. Many of our ancestors have said that the Katsi clan are one of these 5 clans gifted by the Creator. A heavy silence settled over the women once the story finished, so silent that the moaning wind from outside was clearly heard. It's a beautiful but sad story, Sana eventually spoke. Sandra gave her a questioning look. Sad? I don't know really, Sana shrugged. It makes me feel as if the 5 clans were given a burden rather than a gift. Not many people are keen enough to take that perspective, though I shouldn't be surprised. You have always been a remarkable young woman, Sana. Embarrassed, Sana averted her gaze. Thank you. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed 8 times. Here, let me clean these dishes for you, Sana offered, reaching for one of the empty serving platters in the middle of the table. Sana, please. Lana held her hand over the platter to stop her. This was our welcome party to you, don't worry about it. We will take the dishes back with us, said Lana. Only after insisting, Sana was allowed to wipe down a portion of the long dining room table while Ardath chattily wiped down the other side as Lana and Sandra wrapped up any remaining food to go. The women were just making it to the front door with wrapped serving trays and dishes in hand when Sana remembered something she had wanted to ask. Looking to Sandra, she caught the woman's eye. I was wondering about something. Sana wasn't sure how to phrase the question. That sounded strange to her now that she intended to put it into words. Are the wolves around here dangerous? A stillness settled over the 3 women that immediately made Sana feel self-conscious. I mean, of course wolves are dangerous, she hurried to correct herself. But I keep seeing the same black wolf each night, so I was just wondering. Visibly relaxing, Sandra smiled. Don't worry, the wolves around these parts of Druthers Forest are very docile and protective. You have nothing to worry about. Later that night, Sana sat on the edge of her bed after getting out of the shower and grabbed the jar of lotion she kept on the nightstand. Opening the jar, she dipped her fingers into the thick creamy lotion and smoothed it down her legs. Letting the towel fall away, she continued spreading the lotion across her skin. Sandra's answer to her question earlier still lingered in Sana's thoughts. Protective, what did she mean by that? Was she saying that the wolves around her here were dangerous and she simply referred to that violence as protection? Or did she mean something else? It was an odd answer, one that only made Sana dissect the words more. Walking to her dresser, Sana pulled out a pair of underwear and a flannel pajama set. Although it wasn't yet full-blown winter, the crisp fall temperature outside made the large house more than a little chilly. The problem was she was just too darn cheap to turn on the central furnace. She didn't need each room in the house heated. She only needed the room she was currently occupying heated, and that was what space heaters and heating blankets were for. Pulling on a pair of warm socks, Sana glanced out the bedroom window. Sitting in the circular driveway was the black wolf. Even with the darkness of night, she could easily make out the large lupin figure sitting perfectly still below. Moving from the window, she quickly went downstairs, stopping at the front door. Looking through one of the narrow decorative windows that sat on either side of the door, she could see through the matching vestibule windows as the wolf walked up the porch stairs and stopped. The glow of its nocturnal eyes gleamed against the darkness as it stared back at her through the glass, calm and patient. What did it want from her? Sana couldn't understand it. Why did it keep visiting her? Remembering what Sandra said, Sana opened the front door and stepped out into the cool enclosed space of the vestibule. Able to see the wolf much clearer now through the decorative glass of the outer door, Sana paused. Just like the night before, the wolf watched her hesitation and cocked his head before laying down. Reaching for the doorknob, Sana ignored her frenzied heart and turned the knob. Its tail lifted in expectation and began to slowly wag back and forth as if it were tempering its own reaction. With the door open just a crack, Sanaa bent her knees and lowered to a squat partially behind the door and the small opening. She wanted to be able to slam the door shut if she needed to. Now eye level with the beast, she could see the beauty of its golden eyes set against its pitch-black fur. "Hi there," she whispered. Its tail flagged harder behind it as it craned its neck forward, reaching in. Silent request for a pet. Encouraged by the beast's seemingly gentle nature, Sanaa gathered her confidence and extended her left hand towards its big fuzzy head. Sinking into the soft downy fur and resting on top of its warm head, Sanaa let out a shaky, relieved breath. Closing its eyes, the wolf seemed to be just as pleased as it discreetly crawled forward on its stomach, pushing itself further into her hand. Obliging the silent demand, she smiled as she petted the beast further. Enjoying her touch, the wolf laid down further and began to roll onto its side. "Oh, you poor needy thing," she laughed, letting go of the door handle that she had been holding onto with her other hand. She allowed the door to open further as she rubbed its chest and stomach with her other hand. "You were just asking for a belly rub all those nights. Was that all you wanted?" At some point, the sneaky beast had worked its head partially onto her lap as it laid with both paws upward and eyes closed at her ministrations. She could hardly believe this was happening. Here she was kneeling in her open doorway, with a massive black wolf happily snuggled up on her lap while she gave it belly rubs. From this position she could tell the beast was male, and judging by its shiny coat and weight, in seemingly great health. On nature shows, wolves always seem tall and skinny. Not this one. She could feel the strength of his form under her fingertips, a testament that he wasn't missing any meals. "Okay, Mr. Wolf, I have to go," she cooed gently, giving him a few final scratches behind the ear. He seemed so content she was afraid he might not want to move. Surprisingly, he turned back over and lifted his head, freeing her lap so that she could pull away. As carefully as she could, she got up without making two sudden movements as twin golden orbs watched her movements. "Are you going to come back again, or was this just a one-time belly rub service?" Pushing himself up with his front paws, the wolf returned to its regal sitting position and stared at her silently in answer. "Okay then, good night." Closing the door softly until it clicked shut, she took one last peek at the wolf before returning to her. Chapter 6. Sanaa wasn't sure how it ended up this way. It started out with a few innocent pets here and there and some scratches behind the ears every few nights. Gradually the wolf took more. Walking past her with padded steps, he breached the inner sanctum of her home little by little. By the fifth visit he was fully inside of the vestibule enclosure, giving off low growls of content. The night after that, he sneakily nosed himself inside the partially open front door and sat obediently on her entryway rug as he tilted his head back in expectation for scratches. With a heavy sigh and little choice, Sanaa resigned herself to her duty and petted the beast. By his seventh visit, the large black wolf had made itself comfortable on her living room floor. Giving him a narrowed look, she shut the front door behind him. "I see what you're doing," she informed him as she cautiously walked back to her seat on the couch. She had been sitting and enjoying one of her old horror movies and a small bowl of popcorn when she heard the familiar howl coming from the porch. Although she was pretty confident at this point he wasn't going to hurt her, Sanaa still kept a watchful eye on the wolf and moved around him in caution. "You know that I'm still afraid of you, and you know that means you can just get away with practically anything at this point." As if understanding her, the wolf dropped his head onto her lap and gave her a sweet doleful stare. Shaking her head with a resigned smile, she scratched behind his soft ears. "Luckily for me, you're pretty good about leaving on your own," she said, thinking of the previous night when he simply walked to the door and gave her an expectant look before trotting off into the night. "I couldn't imagine having to call the sheriff or even worse, Zac, to save me from a wolf I let in myself." Just imagining Zac's evil glee to her embarrassment made her cringe. The wolf gave her an unexpected whine in response. "Don't whine for him, he certainly doesn't deserve it," she said, smoothing the soft black fur from between his golden eyes back down the slope of his big head. Staring past the flickering TV ahead of them, she looked at the darkened window that still had no curtains put up. If it were daytime she would be able to look out that window and squint and see a peek of Zac's red house. through the trees. For the past week, Zac's attitude to her constant dismissal had grown darker. If there was a meeting with the city's mayors, he was there without invitation. If she needed to speak to Kevin or Adam, somehow, Zac would intercept and gruffly answer her questions, always with a piercing waiting look, wanting her to say more, wanting her to break first. But she never did. It took everything she had not to argue with him to give into the antagonistic game he was playing, but Sanaa endured all the while his patience thinned. Sanaa could feel whatever was about to break behind that crumbling resolve he maintained, approaching her like dark looming clouds of an oncoming storm. The warm, wet sensation to her knee jarred her from her thoughts. With his nose pressed against her bare knee that peeked out from the folds of her robe, the wolf gave her knee another lick before looking back at her. Smiling, she picked up a kernel of popcorn and held it out in the flat of her palm. With a flash of long, sharp teeth, the wolf gently mouthed the piece of popcorn off her hand and swallowed it, happy that he liked the snack. Sanaa scooped up a few more pieces and repeated the process. At some point the sneaky beast had made its way up onto the couch with her, and laid his head in her lap while the rest of its big furry body took up a huge portion of her olive green 6-seat sectional. Smiling to herself, she stroked at the massive head in her lap. This was so unreal. Glancing at her phone on the ottoman, Sanaa stared at it longingly, wishing she could capture this unbelievable moment with a photo. It was the high-pitched canine yawn that woke her. Blinking, Sanaa looked down to see the pair of amber eyes watching her patiently. By now the DVD had played itself to the end and was paused on the title, the screen casting a blue haze on her living room. Shifting slightly, Sanaa waited for the wolf to take her unspoken cue and hop down to the floor. Instantly she missed the warmth his large body had given her, tightening the tie of her robe tighter. She walked to the front door as the sound of the wolf's nails finally clicked against the wooden floor in his pursuit. Stepping out into the vestibule, she opened the door to the cold night air. "Be careful," she said with a shiver, hugging her thin robe even tighter around her as the wind whipped around her bare legs. She let out a soft laugh under her breath. Why did she keep talking to him as if he could understand and respond? To him, she was simply the crazy lady that fed him popcorn and could possibly be a future human snack in the cold winter months. Turning his head, the wolf gave her a silent look over his shoulder. Looking up beyond him towards the drive and down the tree lines, Sanaa frowned at the faint yellow light that glowed through the trees. One of Zac's lights was still on in his house. The wolf was halfway down the porch stairs when a thought went through her mind. She hoped wherever the wolf returned to wouldn't lead him back through the neighborhood. She could only pray his human curiosity stopped with her. She couldn't bear to think what another person would do if they caught the huge black wolf loping through their lawn. A memory from years ago resurfaced in her mind with a clarity that surprised her. It had been at the end of her summer vacation, the first summer she met Zac, and her parents were packing up to leave and saying their goodbyes to friends in town. A group of boys, mostly Watese boys with their signature dark complexions and black hair, stood talking loudly and excitedly in a group. Slung over their shoulders were bows of all kinds, from recurve to compound, and even a few crossbows with the older teens. They all stood waiting patiently for their hunt, led by Adam. Watching the black shape of the wolf sink into the darkness, Sanaa couldn't help but worry for the lonely beast. Mostly everything about fall was absolutely magical. The changes in the leaves, the crispness to the air, the warm comfy clothing, just about everything. What was not and nor will ever be her favorite aspect of the change in the season was the long nights and short days. It felt as if she had only a few hours of daylight to bask in before bam, it was night. It was beyond annoying. Squinting through the darkness, Sanaa drove at a careful speed down the dark two-lane highway back to Tarki. Her meeting in Galding with the mayor, Gabriel, ran way over the time frame she had estimated. 90% of the time was spent easing the man's worries over the colossal failure Antier Falls. Mayor Thomas called Gabriel's previous decision to hire an engineering consultant. She felt drained from that conversation. All she wanted to do was go home, grab a full glass of wine, take a shower, and slip into the cool enveloping crispness of her sheets. Sanaa nearly groaned at the mental image. She could practically feel the coolness of the sheets against her skin. "Just 40 more minutes and you'll be home," she mumbled to herself. Turning up the radio, she sang along to the lyrics as she drove, cresting a hill, she noticed a small light in the distance. The closer she got, she expected the light to get bigger. Did, but not by much. Instinctively, she slowed down. A flash of chrome gleamed in her headlights as she passed by the parked motorcycle. Too narrow to be a headlight, Sanaa replayed the image of the bright LED beam in her mind a few more times even as she slowed her own vehicle along the shoulder. It was a flashlight. There was a dark human-shaped figure kneeling down beside the bike with the flashlight perched in their mouth. Stopping the vehicle, she stared at the figure in her rearview mirror still kneeled by the parked bike. With a stillness that almost seemed unnatural, the figure didn't move, but Sanaa knew he was looking her way. Rolling down her window just a crack, enough for her voice to escape, she took a calculated guess at the man's identity. Zac, she called out as she put the SUV in reverse and slowly backed it down the narrow shoulder of the road. Red brake lights glared against the man, highlighting portions of him and casting the rest of him in deeper, sinister shadows. Stopping, she waited as the figure stood up straight and stepped away from the bike, and at that moment she knew without a doubt that it was Zac. Approaching the driver's side window, Zac stopped and waited for her to roll down her window fully. She expected a grateful smile or even a look of relief. What she did not expect was his dark scowl. "Why are you out here?" he bit out. Shocked, Sanaa turned deeper in her seat toward the window and glared at him with shocked outrage. "Excuse me, I am coming back from a meeting with Mr. Masek. What are you doing playing with your bike on the side of the road at night?" she threw back at him. Leaning his forearm against the top of the SUV's door, Zac leaned forward until his face was closer to hers. "I'm not playing with it. I'm trying to fix it." "Oh," she immediately felt guilty. "Should we call someone?" Zac let out a heavy breath and turned his gaze back in the direction of his bike. "I already tried. Noah didn't pick up." In this position, Sanaa had full view of Zac's strong profile. The firm cut of his jawline set the tone of his naturally fierce face. Even when they were younger, Sanaa noticed Zac was unlike any other boy she had met. Zac didn't look at life the same way his peers did. He glared at it with a biting smirk on his lips. When they were younger, he viewed everything and everyone as something to conquer or something to take. But looking at him now, she didn't sense that same urgent need to prove himself to the world and others. Tracing over his dark skin and up to his defined cheekbones, she followed the heavy black curl of his eyelashes until their eyes met again. Not turning away from the bright amber gaze, she took a moment to identify the air around him now. Confidence, that's what it was. The calming effect of assurance was what was different about him now. No longer was he the young rebel with something to prove. This was a man, a changed man who had gone out into the world reckless and angry and came back certain and composed. Realizing she was staring, Sanaa looked away from his waiting gilded stare. Do you want a ride?" She could feel his eyes linger on the side of her face for a few torturously long moments before he walked around her car and opened the passenger door. Sanaa's heart froze for a second as she realized her miscalculation. Sitting down in the seat, Zac closed the door, encasing them both in the confined darkness of her SUV. To her right, every inch of space seemed to be taken up with his long legs and wide shoulders, making her car feel more like a compact rather than the roomy little SUV it was. Taking a deep breath, Sanaa immediately regretted it. Darn, he smelled good. Needing to take control of the mood from the start, Sanaa put the car in drive, but kept her foot on the brake. "Will it be okay leaving your bike here?" All she could imagine was someone spotting the unattended bike and stealing it for themselves. She watched out of the corner of her eye as Zac stretched one of his long legs out comfortably. "It's fine, no one will touch it," he answered. Taking her foot off the brake, she pulled back out onto the road. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I promise you that they don't want me to come hunt them down," he replied, his voice low and growling, emphasizing each word. Silence bloomed between them as she let the threat of his words take meaning. In her mind, he might not be young and reckless anymore, but that didn't mean his blood didn't course with the same violent capabilities. Not knowing what else to say, Sanaa continued to drive with only the sounds of the radio filling the stilted silence. "How long are we going to do this, Sanaa?" She could feel the pressure of his gaze on the side of her face as she drove. Sanaa tried to keep her voice light and nonchalant as she replied, "What do you mean? This game of you ignoring me?" His voice was thick and rough. Letting his words sink in for a moment, Sanaa realized there was no getting out of this direct question. Turning down the radio volume, she took a deep breath. At first, when I arrived at the house that day, I honestly thought, you might have forgotten me. I didn't want to embarrass you or myself by bringing it up, she confessed. Shifting in his seat, Zac laid his arm next to her along the center armrest. Sanaa had to suppress a shiver at the feeling of his arm hair brushing against her skin. Heat from his skin pulsated from his arm against her in waves, reluctantly reminding her of the moments shared between them in the past where she felt the full searing strength of that heat. Sitting forward in his seat, he turned to look at her until she risked a glance in his direction. His eyes seemed to glow with a low, warm golden light. I have never let you leave my mind, Sanaa, and I think you know that. She didn't know what to say to that, but her pounding heart was not so conflicted. Just as it has always been between them, her body reacted to Zac without any consent from her stunned mind. Desperately needing to change the subject, Sanaa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. When I had dinner with your mother, she mentioned you had not long moved back to Tarki. The passing comment from Sandra had stuck in Sanaa's mind ever since the night of the dinner. It made sense that he would leave. Realistically, Sanaa couldn't imagine someone as capable and determined as Zaccaria spending his whole life in a small, out-of-the-way coastal town like Tarki. Zac was too strong, too razor-sharp to waste those gifts here. Feeling a pang of guilt in her chest, Sanaa tried to focus on the empty dark road ahead of them, and not on the memory of her mother's last argument with her, basically pointing out the same thing about her. No, this town wasn't a waste, Sanaa thought defensively. There was something intrinsically more about Tarki, something thumping beneath the surface that always called to Sanaa, something she could never quite put her finger on. It may be small and out of the way, but Tarki had everything one could need. Instead of an oversized shopping mall, Tarki had Mrs. Clark's boutique, which sold designer jeans, custom handmade dresses, and specially ordered clothes that kept every woman in town scrambling for the new catalog to quickly order the newly released designs. Diversity was easily accounted for in Tarki, with the large spiritual center located in the middle of town. After the old church burned down in the early 80s, the people of Tarki took a page from Antier Falls and built a huge theater-like building that had 5 high-occupancy rooms and a handful of smaller rooms that allowed the 3,000-plus citizens to each have a space for worship. Catholics, Baptists, a mosque, a synagogue, and a few other smaller sects. Everyone was welcomed and comfortably housed. Though despite its progressive community, Sanaa had a hard time imagining Zac staying put for 7 years. I joined the military, he muttered, turning from her to look out the window. Oh, she said softly, remembering Ardath mentioning something about that at dinner. She would have never have guessed that about Zac. Whenever she thought of the military, she thought of rigid rules and stoic men marching into combat and taking orders from shouting commanders. All of the things she would have never imagined Zac willingly participating in. But the answer made sense, she realized. Stealing a glance at his wide forearm next to hers and his jean-covered thighs, she could recognize the changes in him from years ago. Changes that intense physical training would have brought about. Still tall and lean, Zac's body now had more of a swimmer's build with wide shoulders and muscled thighs. Seemingly every pound of gained weight was transformed into solid muscle. What branch? She asked. It was a question she always heard people say in these types of conversations, but honestly Sanaa didn't really have that much of a clue what the branches of the military even consisted of besides the obvious ones like the Navy, the Marines, and etc. His arm next to hers shifted as he answered, brushing against hers. A very specialized sector. Taking another glance at him, Sanaa's chest tightened to see that he was looking directly at her. Naturally, her gaze followed the pale discolored line of the scar over his right eye. Is that where you got your scar? She asked with a wince of regret. She hoped it wasn't too rude of a question to ask as it sounded. You know, Zac began thoughtfully, his deep voice filling the empty spaces around them. The moment I got this, he traced the pale jagged scar with the tip of his finger. The first thing I thought when I got this wasn't about the possible damage to my eye or the pain. I immediately thought of you. Wondered what you would think when I saw you again. By now, the tightening in her chest was borderline painful. Gripping the wheel Tighter with both hands, Sanaa stared at the dark road ahead of them as he continued to speak, fearing and craving all at once for his next words. Because I knew we would see each other again. I just hoped it wouldn't disgust you. The surety in that statement filled her with a sudden warning. Later, when she was back in the safety of her house and far away from this man, she would thank God for giving her the clarity in this moment and resist being pulled back into old habits. Raising her chin, she cast him a piercing look, staring directly into those dangerously hypnotic eyes of his before looking back to the road. Then you must not remember me very well, Zaccaria, because if you did, you would know that I could care less about a scar. Zac let a deep pleased chuckle that only confused and irritated her. Tell me, why did you come back? He asked. Taken aback by the sudden shift in topic, she answered honestly. I don't really know. I felt. How could she phrase it? A need, an overwhelming want. Would any of those justify or explain why she longed to come back here? I felt a pull, Zac offered softly. Sanaa's breath caught in her throat at the uncanny accuracy, as if he could read her thoughts. How could he know? Yes, she breathed, hating to admit it. She could see the flash of his sharp smile in the dark, the satisfaction practically rolled from him. Yeah, I felt the same way. Yes, but you have family down here, she argued. And that makes sense to feel that way. But all of my family is back in Seattle, and they are not in favor whatsoever of my decision to move back here. No, he shook his head. My need to come back to Tarkey had nothing to do with my family. It wasn't a familial feeling that pulled me back or nostalgia. What was it? She dared herself to whisper, despite her poor, exhausted, thrashing heart begging her not to ask. The feeling of his arm shifting next to hers nearly made her jump. Feeling the heat from his presence get closer, she could see out of the corner of her eye, as he leaned just a little bit closer to her. It was knowing that at the end of that feeling that drew me was someone feeling the same thing, waiting for me. Someone I have been waiting years for. Someone I knew in my gut that would be back. Oh God, she felt panicked by his words, like he forcibly exposed a secret she knew she had been trying to keep from herself, to keep locked away deep inside, to avoid its presence. But here he was barging back into her life and ripping that hidden truth back out into the light, forcing her to acknowledge its possibility. I did not come back for you, Zaccariah, she declared, her voice rising a little too high. He let out a deep noise past his smirking lips that insinuated that he begged to differ. Frustrated, she nearly gasped in relief at the familiar blue glow of the gas station's lights ahead. I need to get some gas, she announced, her words clipped. Perfect. Zac leaned back and straightened in his seat, giving back the few precious inches of space he took from her. This is where Noah lives. I will see if he is home and if he will go pick up my bike. Pulling into the brightly lit station, she marveled how much had changed over the years. When she was younger, the original station had been owned by a cranky old geezer who let the place run down to rot and ruin. The original building used to be an old wooden 2-story trapper's house that had been converted into a rundown gas station with only 4 gas pumps. Now it stood as a brightly lit modern 10-pump station with a large 2-story white and blue house. The first floor of the station was used as the basic convenience store and cashier stand, while the upstairs was designated for what she assumed was the living space. I think I remember him, but not well. Have I met him before? She asked, parking the car at one of the empty pumps. It was late and most of Tarkey was either asleep or getting ready to go to sleep. Like most small towns, Tarkey was a place people got up extremely early and went to bed at nightfall, making it not unusual that she and Zac were the only ones here. Zac nodded before opening the door to the car and swinging one foot down. Do you remember the only other cousin my age I would hang out with? Her memories churned as she did her best to remember anything beyond Zac's handsome face all those summers ago. You mean the one that you hung out with and spent your free time rebelling against that old sheriff with? Yep, that's the one, Zac grinned without a shred of remorse. With the added fluorescent gas station lights, Sanaa could see that his silky dark hair was half pulled into a ponytail while allowing the rest to hang free around his neck. Then yes, I remember him vaguely, she answered, looking away from him. Stay put. I'm going to go see if he is here. Shutting the car door before she could reply to that, Zac walked over to the blue and white building. Taking the stairs on the side of the house two at a time, Zack opened the screen door and knocked on the door. A few moments later he disappeared. Inside. Why did I even pick him up? She grumbled to herself. I should have let him sit there in the dark until morning. Recalling his last remark of stay put, Sana bristled at that. Reaching into the back seat, Sana grabbed her purse and fished out her credit card. Turning back around in her seat, she let out a clipped scream at the man standing at her window, wearing a dirty canvas onesie that at once in its life was probably a pale blue. The badly stained outfit looked as if it hadn't been washed in months. Unflinching, the man just stood there and stared directly at her on the other side of her window. It was the same man who creepily stared at her in the grocery store the other day. Becker something. Walter Becker, she believed. Pressing her hand to her chest, Sana took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. Okay, it's nothing to freak out over, she thought. Oregon was one of the 2 states in the U.S. that once required attendants to pump customers' gas instead of the normal self-service, though most rural towns had always foregone that custom. Pressing the button so that the window rolled down a couple of inches only, Sana leaned hesitantly forward to the glass. I'm fine. I can pump it myself, she called out through the crack. Still, he just stood there, not saying anything and never looking away. Getting a better look at him, she realized his clothes weren't the only unwashed aspect about him. His hair, which was gray, thinning and kept pushed back in a greasy pile from his face, looked as if it hadn't been washed in a week. With the gray in his hair and beard, he looked to be in his 50s, though Sana couldn't be sure. It was the piercing, hateful look in his eyes, however, that kept her thoughts in disarray as he stared at her. Alarmed, she tried to think of something. Maybe the poor man was mentally handicapped, or maybe there was something else the matter. Does your credit card machine not work? His eyes stayed unfeeling and focused on her as he lifted one stiff arm and pointed to the store. No, you will need to come inside and pay there. His voice was as to be expected, scratchy and rough, but not at all slow or hard to understand, which made her think he may be mentally fine. Following the length of his arm to the station's storefront, she bit her lip and looked desperately to the windows above where Zack supposedly went. The store was empty and partially lit on the inside, as if they turned off half the lights in the unused sections and only left the lights over the cashier on. Every instinct in her body was telling her not to get out and go inside as instructed. She paused, trying to come up with something to say. Something that would make him just go away so she could pump her gas herself. You can't just sit here if you don't get gas, the man said angrily. There was a manic gleam of impatience in his eyes. The unmistakable sound of a screen door slamming shut and heavy footsteps thumping down the stairs made her sag with relief in her seat. Followed by a familiar-looking person, Zack's acute stare jumped from her inside the car to Becker standing near her door. Here. He handed Becker a few folded bills before dismissing the man. You can leave. Becker turned quickly away from Zack and walked to the man behind him, who she assumed was Noah. Rolling down her window completely, Sana frowned at Zack. You didn't have to pay for that, she said, despite the fact she was more than relieved he intervened. Taking the nozzle from the pump, Zack flipped open her vehicle's gas hatch and began filling the car before coming back to lean on the window frame of her door. Invading her space and forcing her to lean back, Zack fixed her with a serious stare. Did he say something to you? Raising a hand, she quickly shook her head. No, why? Zack gave her a heavy-lidded, knowing look. Because I could practically smell your fear upstairs. Laughing, she rolled her eyes. He used to say exaggerated things like that all the time when they were younger. She would have assumed he would have grown out of the odd habit by now. I wasn't afraid, she clarified. Not really, I mean, I knew you and your cousin weren't that far dash. But, he questioned, not letting the subject drop. But, she let the word stretch out, annoyed by his persistence. That man was really creeping me out. He just kept staring at me and telling me to get out. To pay in that creepy dark store. Zack nodded and turned to look back to the shop where the man and Noah had gone back to. Something shifted in his golden eyes before he turned back to her with a playful smile. I'm going to tell Noah you think his shop is creepy, he taunted. Do not. She protested. I have never even met the man officially, I don't Want him thinking that I said that about his business. With one of her hands gripping the steering wheel, Zac reached out and enclosed his hand over her wrist, the rough pad of his thumb gently stroking the pulse point just below the palm of her hand. Your heart rate has slowed back to normal, she heard him whisper next to her. How did he do that? How did he always know exactly how she was feeling? It was a trick of his that he used on her often in their youth. Zac could always tell when she was sad or excited, but most of all he could always sense her fear, as if he really could smell it. Sanaa couldn't bring herself to turn her head back to his. She couldn't meet his gaze right now, not while he was touching her. If she did, she would be exposed. He would read her eyes like a book and know all the things she tried to keep locked away from both him and herself. Don't worry about Becker, he said, finally letting go of her hand. I will talk to Noah about him and make sure he steers clear of you. It took her a minute to process his words. No, don't do that. But Zac was already pulling the pump from her car and walking around to the passenger door. Once he was seated next to her, she continued, I don't want it to be weird when I inevitably have to come back here for gas. You're still a worrier, I see, he quipped. Putting the car in drive, she forgot about the creepy man and focused on her irritating passenger as she pulled back onto the highway. And you're still reckless. The drive back to her house thankfully only took a few minutes, leaving them both in silence, but not uncomfortably so. Felt familiar, calm, even allowed her a moment of exhalation she didn't realize she needed. This meeting she had been avoiding with Zac since that day he gave her the keys to her place wasn't as bad as she thought it was going to be. She expected an exchange of heated words or a repeat of the past where he bullied her into doing exactly what he wanted, but it wasn't like that this time. Feeling confident, she felt lighter and empowered. Sanaa resisted the urge to throw a snarky smirk at the man sitting to her right. Her move back here was not a mistake, and no matter how much Zac had changed, she would not be intimidated by him anymore. She could handle him. Seeing the red house coming up on the drive, she slowed the car down. Just drive up to your house. He nodded his head in the direction of her house down the road. I will walk back. Noah should be bringing my bike back soon. Slowly releasing her foot off the brake, she obliged, driving the short distance to her house. But there are wolves around here, she said worriedly, thinking of her big black wolf encountering Zac on his way home. She could see his head turn towards her in her peripheral. Are you worried? For me? He grinned sharply. If I was, I immediately regret it, she replied dryly, putting the car in park near the porch stairs. Opening his car door just as she opened hers, he waited for her to circle the car before following her up the porch steps. Don't worry, if anything, I'm the big bad wolf to be afraid of. I didn't think it was possible for your ego to have gotten any bigger, she murmured as she pulled out her separate house key from her purse. I guess I was wrong. He laughed deeply, a sound she suddenly realized she hadn't truly heard in years. It's not ego if it's the truth. Unsure how to process the sudden painful longing in her chest, Sanaa turned back to face the door, looking away from his handsome, scarred face. Good night. Her key was sliding into place, ready for each cut groove in the metal to catch the awaiting pins inside to unlock the door when the heavy forearm thumped against the door above her head. Her eyes drifted over the fine dark hairs that whispered across the taut brown flesh. As if reacting to her gaze, she watched as the thickly corded muscles moved and flexed under his skin. Sanaa could feel the heat of his big body leaning in behind her as he braced himself against the door, trapping her to one spot. With little choice, she took a deep breath and turned around within the confines he created for her. A slow smile touched his lips, taking her breath away. Sharp white teeth gleamed in the porch light. Are you still afraid of me, Sanaa? Sanaa tried to look past him, but he was too close. The heat from his body was smothering her senses. She could smell that same beguiling scent of his that overpowered her summers and haunted her dreams ever since. Somehow encapsulating the fresh, intoxicating breath of the forest and the rich male undertone of leather, a scent so uniquely his, so nostalgic it felt like a dozen arrows piercing her heart as she inhaled deeply. Yes, she finally answered breathlessly. You never gave me a reason not to be. His smile faded, and a flash of betrayal passed through his gaze. Do you really believe I would hurt you, Sanaa? He demanded, anger deepening his voice to a near growl. Sanaa wasn't ready for this conversation yet, not now. She knew deep down that. First day she realized Zac was back in Tarkey and back in her life, this conversation was inevitable. But she wasn't ready for it now. Turning her head, she stared at the porch floorboards as she tried to think of something to take control of this situation. Answer me, he growled, leaning closer into her. Sanaa could feel the heat of his face near her exposed throat and shuddered. Looking back at him, her stomach jumped at the proximity of his face to her. His lips were only inches away while his gilded gaze shined with anger in the low light between them. No, I know you won't hurt me, she answered truthfully, unable to keep her gaze on his. Then what will it take? Zac whispered darkly. One hand lifted to her chin and turned her face back to his. Despite the anger in his words, his touch was soft, careful even. Sanaa had to resist the urge to hold his hand against her cheek and nuzzle deeper into the broad warmth of it. Tilting her chin up to his, he forced her to look at him. Should I go back to the old days and push you around and just take what I want? He threatened. Softly, forcing her to remember the hard-edged boy he used to be, the boy that never took no for an answer. There isn't anyone here to hide from now, no parents, no grandparents, no little brothers in the next room. Should I, Sanaa? Do you want me to take you through that door and lay you out on that dining room table and show you just how much I missed you? Should I show you just how much this game between us has driven me to the edge of my fucking patience? The constant undergrowl in his words ended in a vicious snarl, flashing a glimpse of those white fangs of his. Her heart was beating so fast her body felt jittery and weak. Licking her dry lips, a movement his golden gaze followed with predatory detail, Sanaa opened her mouth to say something but nothing came out. Sliding his hand gently along the line of her jaw until his fingers reached her hair, Sanaa suppressed a whimper at the warm feeling of his hand spearing through her tresses, knowing from past experience what he intended to do next. Carefully and deliberately, Zac wrapped her long hair around his fist until he pulled her head back against the door, exposing her throat. Staring down at her in this new position, he observed his prey with a cold, determined look. I won't be like any of the other bastards you probably dated. His lips curled in disgust at the words. I won't wait for you to tell me what this is going to be. I have waited too long for you, Sanaa. He rasped, each word becoming deeper while his pupils constricted to mere dots of laser intent. If you keep ignoring me, I am going to drastically change the dynamic of this ongoing reunion between us, from waiting patiently to taking. Sanaa trembled in his grip. Is that a threat, Zaccaria? Tilting his head, Zac gave her a cruel smile. Yes, it most certainly is. She tried to shake her head, but she forgot he held her firm. Fear, hope, arousal, anger. All of these emotions swirled inside of her at once. Pushing at his chest, she tried to fight back. You can't dash. His grip in her hair tightened almost painfully. I can, he snarled. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain of her scalp but at the helplessness she found herself in now. He was doing it all over again. Why was she always fooled by the handsome smile he showed in the daylight when she knew for a fact that his smile came with fangs? You dash, she began, but her argument was cut short with his tightening grip. Leaning down until his chest was pressing directly into hers and his lips hovered centimeters above her own, she felt the tickling whisper of his breath against her. Do not ignore me anymore, Sanaa. She couldn't take her eyes from his lips. Every part of her being wanted to feel that familiar pressure, to engulf herself in the thunderstorm that was Zaccaria. Watiz. Not trusting herself to say anything, she simply nodded in reply. The grip in her hair suddenly released. Soothingly, Zac ran his fingers on her tender scalp before pulling away. Ignoring his sharpening gaze, she prayed he didn't see the flash of disappointment on her face at his retreat. Putting one hand in his pocket, he stared at her with an unreadable hard expression. Park your car closer to the stairs from now on. Bears like to come out of the woods at the smell of food and just sheer curiosity. Watching him walk down the porch steps, Sanaa took the opportunity to try and control her heart rate when she thought of something. What about wolves? She called out. Are there a lot of them around? Standing on the gravel drive now, the fine rocks crunched beneath his feet as he turned slightly to fix his bright gaze back at her. Yes, he answered so softly she was surprised she could hear it over the chilly gust of wind that blew through the trees. But the ones around here are only dangerous if provoked.